I will launch. Hello, everybody. Welcome to this month's edition of the CITI webinar series on global digital governance. I am William Drake. I am Director of International Studies at the Columbia Institute for Teleinformation and adjunct professor at the Business School. This is a series that we've been running for 3 years now, which has covered a lot of ground on different aspects of the global digital governance landscape. Videos of the past sessions that we've done are all on our website, and I just posted the link in the chat there. They are also posted to YouTube if you're interested. So anybody who's ever wanted to know what we've covered before, it's all there. Also, in the link I put in the chat, I put another link, which is for the if you're interested in being in our database for direct announcements of the events, please just shoot an email to the address there in the screen. Normally, we begin with a few minutes from Ellie Noem, who's the director of the Columbia Institute for Teleinformation, but Ellie is at a conference and cannot join us. So I'm just doing the welcome as well as the introduction to the topic this time. We will not be meeting in March due to travel on my part, but we will reconvene in April with another topic. So I look forward to seeing people then at that time. We also have one other possible change to the lineup. One of our speakers is just sent an email saying he has a last-minute crisis and will be joining us late. But luckily, since I actually added unusually a fourth speaker just the other day to this event, we still have a full boat, so it should all be good. So, all right, let me start by introducing the topic a little bit. We're going to talk today about interstate cyber conflict and cybersecurity and efforts in the United Nations to establish multilateral sort of guideposts around cyber conflict. And I guess I should start. I have to admit that this is a topic area that I have always had deeply conflicted feelings about. Back in the 1990s, when I was working at a foreign policy think tank in Washington, D.C., I ran a discussion group that had people in it from the State Department, the Defense Department, the intelligence agencies, things like that. And they would all talk in very scary tones about, the coming information warfare and terrorist net wars and how we could soon face a digital Pearl Harbor and so on. And it all sounded very kind of like dark and ominous and so on. And that kind of fed a huge growth in the Beltway, Washington, D.C., armies of Beltway consultancies that were cashing in on the growing frenzy around cybersecurity and cyber war issues and things like that. And a lot of us who were involved in the early internet governance stuff kind of felt like, are you kidding me? Come on. I mean, we were focusing on trying to get the internet governance structures stood up, talking about the growth of e-commerce, the global digital divide, internet freedom, and all this talk about militarization and cyber war seemed really like maybe a little bit hyperbolic. But as it turned out, the intelligence and defense people were right, largely. Cyberspace has indeed become rapidly militarized. States and state-aligned actors are engaging in an increasingly wide variety of attacks on a day-to-day basis, everything spyware, information gathering, interception and eavesdropping, planting malware, ransomware, all this kind of stuff. We all know the litany of horrors. And at the same time, we're seeing the use of digital tools in hybrid warfare, the Russia-Ukraine war, the Gaza, everything else. So all this has become the focus then, a major focus of national security and defense establishments worldwide, with all the accompanying institutional baggage of uniformed people at meetings and talking about the internet, which I always find kind of creepy, and a lot of technology and enormous multi-billion-dollar budgets around cyber war, cyber defense, vast commercial security industries with non-governmental actors all over the place on both sides of the battle lines. And denizens of this space declared, the cyber, quote unquote, to be the fifth domain of warfare alongside land, sea, air, and space. Those of us who talk more about the e-commerce type stuff, we talk about digital, but for the military folks, it's the cyber. Okay, whatever. But anyway, so now we've got all around the world, governments of devising cyber conflict military doctrines, developing weaponized infrastructure, thinking through game theorizing and war planning around deterrence and first use and all this. It's quite a thing. And also alongside that, you have this vast ecosystem of non-state actors, including the burgeoning commercial mercenaries world that works closely with some states as well as sometimes independently for hire. So all this inevitably was going to end up in the United Nations, of course, and started with the Russians in 1988, introducing, and they've done every year, introducing declarations on the need for UN action in this space. Russia called back then for a UN International Code of Conduct for Information Security. The Russians have an expansive conception of cyber conflict, which includes information content, of course, as opposed to the Western kind of approach, which is more focused on networks and information resources. By 2011, the Russians had a joint proposal with China and others for a new kind of a treaty mechanism that would curb the dissemination of information and protect sovereign information spaces, whatever those are. And all this led in 2003 to a UN General Assembly resolution from Russia that led to the creation of the first group of government experts on advancing responsible state behavior in cybersecurity in the context of international security. It's quite a mouthful, but GGEs, the groups of government experts, which are usually government experts from the Security Council of States and others from different geographical groupings. And we've had 6 of these for 2-year terms between 2004 and 2021 that studied the issues, often had a lot of political problems, but the 2015 report that they adopted was particularly important in establishing certain core norms and pillars for cyber conflict, which we'll come back to, became the basis of a UN framework. After some years of these things running, in the end, Russia was not entirely happy with what it was getting out of the GGEs, and so proposed a resolution to create a new open-ended working group, meaning all governments could participate in the bargaining, as well as non-state actors, observers could participate. And so for a couple of years, 2019, 2021, I think, we had both the GGE and OEWG, the open group and the group of experts working in parallel. But now the GGEs have finished and the OEWG continues, and they just had a meeting in New York last week, which is what led me to want to do this session. The OEWG sessions have seen strong geopolitical divisions between democracies and former democracies like the United States and autocracies. But nevertheless, in 2021, the OEWG endorsed a mix of reports and General Assembly resolutions, which collectively constitutes sort of a framework, which has come to be recognized as existence, the UN Framework on Responsible State Behavior in Cyberspace, which is built around 5 pillars of international law, norms, rules, and principles, confidence building measures, capacity building, and cooperation, and has also 11 core norms that are supposed to inform government behavior in this space, 8 of which are positive steps that should be taken, like cooperating to deal with attribution of cyber incidents, preventing criminal and terrorist uses of cyber tools, protecting critical information infrastructure, responding to reasonable requests for assistance from other states, seeking to protect the integrity of supply chains, and so on. And also some actions that states should avoid. Governments, this is a kind of a difficult one in terms of implementation. Governments are not supposed to knowingly allow their territory to be used to commit internationally wrongful acts, which of course, some of the governments involved in these negotiations very much do that. Governments should not engage in cyber activities that damage essential services and critical information infrastructures in other countries. So it's a whole nexus of norms and sort of soft law that has developed in the United Nations, which continues to be carried forward. And the OEWGs in their meetings have dealt with a wide range of issues that are familiar to people who work in the world of national security, from non-interference and self-defense thresholds. When is it okay to respond to an attack? With what kind of tools? When can you use a kinetic or military response to a cyber attack? Due diligence questions about, controlling what actors within your country do, the application of international law, which has been kind of a big issue, especially with regard to humanitarian law, whether or not to develop new principles and norms, and in particular, whether to have a new binding international instrument. The Russians and the Chinese are pushing for a new international treaty akin to the recently adopted and soon to be signed off on Cybercrime Treaty, which is highly problematic, which was also started by Russia. The problems of scope and what kind of issues are covered by cyber conflict, attribution, how do you do that, accountability, what consequences there should be, if any, and so on. So there's a wide range of dispute settlement, wide range of issues that governments are dealing with in the OEWG negotiations. And when the OEWG, I hate this acronym, ends this summer, after that, it has been agreed to establish a permanent mechanism, a new international organizational nexus in the United Nations for ongoing discussions around cybersecurity. They're supposed to be action-oriented. So that will be a very interesting space for internet mavens to watch, needless to say. And I should also say there's also been a lot of non-governmental action in this space. There have been efforts by individual companies like Microsoft with its Digital Peace Project, the Cybersecurity Tech Accord, Paris Peace Forum, the Global Commission on Stability of Cyberspace, the Global Forum on Cyber Expertise, a lot of groups that have tried to either deal with the operational aspects of promoting cybersecurity or trying to influence the development of global cyber norms, both within the United Nations and outside. So a lot going on in this space. And what we're going to do today is try and step back from all these individual kinds of things to get a big picture take on where are we with all this stuff. And to do that, we have a great panel of people who've been heavily involved in the UN processes and many other aspects of these issues. We have a little bit of a late shift, as I mentioned at the outset. So our first, one of our speakers is going to have to join late due to a last minute problem. That's Alexander Klimberg, who's a researcher and advisor at a number of think tanks, former executive of the World Economic Forum, author of many studies and a book on this stuff. He was the initiator and director of the Global Commission on the Stability of Cyberspace. And he'll be joining us from Austria when he's able to get online. Sheetal Kunar is also with us here now. Joining us from London. She is a consultant and expert on internet governance and human rights issues. She previously headed Global Partner Digital's multilateral engagement work, in which context she was a close observer of and writer about the UN cybersecurity processes. So she's with us from London. Chris Painter has been a prosecutor of high-profile cybercrime cases and a senior official in the Departments of Justice, the FBI, the National Security Council, and the State Department during the Obama administration. He was the first dedicated high-level cyber diplomat. And since leaving government, he served as a commissioner on the Global Commission for Stability of Cyberspace and the president of the Global Forum on Cyber Expertise, among other things. He's joining us from Washington, D.C. And unusually for this series, as I said, today we have a fourth person who was going to be a discussant, but since Alex is late, maybe he can join earlier. When I was watching the OEWG online, I noticed Janis Karklin speaker, and I've known Janis for 20 years from the World Summit Information Society, and he was there representing the Latvian government. Janis is Latvia's ambassador at large on the UN Global Agenda. Previously, he was ambassador and permanent representative to the Council of Europe, the UN organization in Geneva, the UN Conference on Disarmament, was founding director of the NATO Strategic Communications Center of Excellence, and assistant director general of UNESCO. And he was also the president of the preparatory committee for the World Summit on Information Society's second phase. So he's joining us from Riga, Latvia. So great panel of people, and a little bit longer introduction than usual since Ellie wasn't here, but now we can get into the meat of the conversation. What we're going to do, as always, is that I'm going to pose a few broad questions to the panelists. We'll go around the table, and then at the top of the hour, we will open up to all participants to join in the conversation, and we hope people will be up for weighing in on the debate. But we've had a lot of good open discussions in this series, which I think is one of the calling cards of this series relative to a lot of other webinar series where it's very top down. So we hope people will want to join the conversation when we get to that point. So let's start with what's going on in the United Nations in the multilateral setting around cyber conflict and cyber war and all these issues. If people could talk a bit about the OEWG process and the larger debates within the UN in terms of what are the key battle lines that we've seen between states and their respective coalitions. What are the big issues that are animating and complicating the process? What are the different parties fighting over? And importantly, what have they achieved? What have they been able to agree on or not agree on, and why so far? Let's give people an overview of the UN space. I think that's a good place to start. So I'm just going to go in the order that I'm looking at on the screen. So Chris, why don't we start with you, and then we'll go.
Sure. And
Dennis.
I've been involved in this process really since it began, almost since it began, when we had the 2013 consensus to international law applied, and I think you gave a good summary of what's out there. I think there's two things to note. There was remarkable progress early on through 2013 and 2015 after a long period of stalemate to agree on two things. The international law applies in cyberspace, and some states like Russia and China thought it didn't, and it was a free fire zone, so that was significant. Now, how international law applies, people still can't agree on. So one of the battle lines still is what does international law mean in cyberspace, and getting any progress on that. And I think the best we've done there is have a number of states come forward and say what their views on this are, rather than getting either any consensus or really any real, I think, good discussion about this, because there's such a difference between Russia and China and others, and the U.S., at least the U.S. is formally constituted. We'll see where the U.S. goes in the future. The U.S. and Europe and more like-minded states. And I'd say that one interesting part of that is when we talk about international humanitarian law, the law of armed conflict, and this has been a long-standing thing. The Chinese in particular, but the Russians have joined them, don't want to even talk about that because they think that even talking about LOAC justifies the militarization of cyberspace, whereas we all know those laws are to keep people safe, when in the reality that cyberspace and the real world have both become militarized, and it's meant to protect civilians. So that's been an impasse that hasn't been really joined. The other is, after that, I think, spurt of progress, and you mentioned the OEWGs. I think the biggest thing about the first OEWG, and we're now in almost the end of the second one, was getting all the countries in the world to actually participate in these debates. So even though it was a Russia suggestion, I think it was quite positive in getting all the countries, including developing world countries, involved, and really highlighting some of the issues and getting buy-in from all those countries at that level, that the norms that have been agreed to, the normative framework that you mentioned, and the international law and confidence building measures and capacity building were all key pillars, and they all agreed. So that was great. Now, this most recent OEWG has been a little more fraught. It's been a little slower. The low-hanging fruit, to the extent there was low-hanging fruit, had been picked. So you're now, in the last 5 years, it sounds like a Star Trek episode, the 5-year mission, although I'm not sure that they've explored that many new places. I met that many new people. But it's made, as the chair of the OEWG likes to say, incremental progress, and that's been things like creating a point of contact directory, making some progress in capacity building, but not really clear where that's going yet. But it's been slow, and it's been slow, not surprisingly, because cyber is part of a larger geopolitical process. And as everyone on this call knows, and everyone in the world knows, the geopolitics is kind of a mess, and it's been a mess for a while, where you've had Russia, particularly since the invasion of Ukraine, China and others having a very different view of the future of cyberspace, and not really willing to compromise on issues. When we had the norms back in 2015, there was actually common interest. Russia and China and the US all had a common interest in not having our infrastructures attacked. But now that consensus, there's just not a consensus now. So I was at the OEWG last week. I've been going to many different meetings for that. And I'd say the two biggest issues now really are, one, what are they going to agree on, if anything, by the July report? They have to do they've done incremental reports, which have been incremental, but what are they going to do in the final report? What new things can they say? What can they say that's going to be significant, that shows advance? And the second, which you alluded to, is what is going to come next. I mean, a big issue has been, what is this permanent mechanism going to look like? The Chinese and Russians have been pushing for something that's similar to the OEWG, which frankly sometimes is like listening to paint dry. It's a number of countries making interventions. There's not a lot of interaction. Stakeholders have had a role, but many stakeholders have been excluded by Russia. About 40 have been on the cast of a single veto by Russia, and now sometimes Russia and China have been excluded from the discussions, including companies like Microsoft and others. So that's been really a significant problem. So if you want to look at the different issues, I think the kind of like-minded countries want a more inclusive environment, and more action oriented, as you said, environment that's actually make progress on these issues. Whereas I think the Russians and Chinese are more happy to have the status quo. And the problem with the status quo is it's not just not inclusive, but it also kind of emulates, for people who know, the UN Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Space, which essentially, you could have a talk shop forever and never make any progress. And that might be a good release valve, perhaps, but it doesn't actually do anything. And so that's a problem.
Mhm.
And I think the like-minded countries want something much more practical, working group, something going forward. There is no consensus. This is a consensus group. I should note that all of these are consensus groups. So if they don't reach consensus, nothing happens. And if I had to make a prediction, I don't have to make a prediction, but I'll make a prediction, is that you'll get to July, there's a likelihood of a train wreck where they can't agree, and then it will go to the first committee for some votes on competing resolutions, which is problematic because one thing you've heard from a lot of the developing countries is they do not want to do multiple processes. They don't want to involve, like when they had the GG and the OEWG at the same time, countries are like, we can't staff these. I mean, we can't send some from VG to everything. We're also the people who do the work, and that's a real problem. So where this ends up, I think, is really unclear at this point. Where that ends up on that, I think, is very unclear. You're quite right that Russia and China still look at information security and going after content, where the US and others look at really cybersecurity. There are lots of other issues that are bound up on this. And I don't see a clear path for an agreement on this right now. But sometimes things happen. So we'll see what happens in July. That's going to be a really interesting meeting to watch.
Yeah, no kidding. Great, Chris. That's a good start for us. Thanks. Yeah, I watched the OEWG all week, and I was shocked. I mean, if you sit through enough UN meetings, you sometimes there's always that thing of everything's been said, but not yet by everybody, right?
Yeah.
And there was that dynamic of so now let's hear Fiji say the same thing. But I mean, it was very clear that there are still some fundamental divides on the way this permanent mechanism will be stood up, and a lot of other issues. So I don't know where they go. Sheetal, your thoughts about where we are, what's been achieved, what are the big geopolitics around this stuff?
Thanks, Bill. And it's great to hear from Chris as well, especially as you were there last week. And I haven't been following as closely for the last couple of years the OEWG and the first committee processes. So it was helpful. I did do some homework, of course. So it was nice to go down memory lane. And actually, one of the sort of insights I suppose I wanted to share here was that in doing so and trying to think about what has happened in the last couple of years, it's different. It was both comforting and I think you maybe used the word depressing or something earlier, Bill. In equal measure, what I found, which is, like you were saying, Chris, incremental work, which is what I think you would expect, considering the political climate, but also the nature of the institution we're talking about, the UN. But in a way, I thought that was positive. And I'm not just trying to play devil's advocate here. I think, well, one of the things I remember from being involved in the process for a number of years is that metaphors are very popular. At the OEWG, there was often a use of metaphors, like the annual report that's adopted was likened to a smoothie, and everyone was going to have to, appreciate different kind of ingredients to the smoothie, but everyone had to drink. Anyway, I would bore you with that. But the point is, I was trying to think of a metaphor that likened that perhaps communicates what I was thinking about the progress, the incremental progress, and I think it's a bit like having the space at the first committee and having these meetings every few months is like having a port that ships or any kind of vehicle is docking at, and that is. You can see perhaps the world that we're talking about in cybersecurity as this like wild sea. But and this is not a perfect metaphor at all, but I think that's sometimes how it's seen. And what I think is positive about what has happened over the last 20 or so years is that that port still exists. The climate might be stormy, but it's not been broken completely, and it's still there. And even if I think we need to still keep building it, and the questions around what we build and how we build it, which, Chris, you were talking about, these lines of tension and disagreement around the very structure and format of future dialogue. There's also the question of the role of stakeholders and how inclusive these discussions should be. There's the questions around the application of international law, of course. And they seem like really basic issues and questions, but I think the fact that there is a framework, there is, like I say, these institutions and something that's been built means that in the last couple of years, and I wasn't expecting to see it all ripped up at all, it hasn't been. And I think that that's important, especially as we talk about new threats. And emerging technologies, that even though it sounds a bit like everyone says the same thing over and over again, that's, I think, actually part of how norms are developed and entrenched, that more actors say the same thing, and in that sense come to an agreement about what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. And so, which is essentially the work that has been happening. So just quickly before we move on, because I didn't want to just repeat what Chris was saying, because I think that was super helpful to get a sense of what hasn't shifted really and what the disagreements still are. And like you say, it's something that will potentially spell even more challenging times if agreement can't come to in the next meeting. I think when we're talking about impact, and it would be good to hear from others about what we would see as impact in this space. The impact of the norms, the impact of the framework. There are two aspects, I think. One is, and they're difficult to quantify, one is more cybersecurity. Does that mean as more digitization happens, there is not a proportional increase in the number of attacks on data and systems and institutions and people? Is that what we're talking about? Or is it also that national frameworks are more kind of aligned, and the resourcing that governments spend on cybersecurity is increased, and it is increased on similar areas? For example, the norms have spelled out that securing supply chains and addressing vulnerabilities and perhaps developing vulnerability disclosure processes are important. So that kind of a space for people to agree on that, I think, could be seen as impact. Now, the impact of the OEWG on that, I suppose there's research into that, but I guess that's something we can discuss. I think it has happened. There has been more alignment on what we need to think about as a global community, what we need to spend resources on. There's still a lot to do, but there is that common reference point, that port that is docked at, every few months to come and discuss it. And hopefully, I think, it's something to build on. Stop there.
Can I just add that the chair has fond of saying the meetings themselves are a confidence building measure, that the fact that people are getting together, and it is true, having people repeat them, it has been very helpful. There's something called I should note, the Women in Cyber Fellowship Program. So a lot of countries, a lot of developing countries in particular, many more women have gotten involved in the process over the years and are making interventions. I think it leads the UN processes in terms of women interventions, which is not probably a great statistic because the UN is pretty bad in that, but still it's almost half of them, which is pretty significant. So that alone also is getting more buy-in into these norms.
Right.
I'll leave the impact to a later question, which I
yeah, we'll talk about it more. But Giannis, you were there in the room, alas, the entire time, and have been participating in this for a while. Viewing this from a government position, I imagine a negotiator position, I imagine, is a bit different. Do you have any thoughts about what have been the big ticket sticking points? Where are we with the process, etc.?
Yeah, no, thank you for including me. I have been involved in open-ended working groups in December. This was my second meeting, and of course the experience that I had in Geneva, I fully experienced that in New York. There are some slight difficulties, but in principle, the process is more or less the same in UN system. And this is the first point. If somebody expects a quick result in UN, that's the wishful thinking. UN is slow, and development of or achieving any kind of progress usually takes a couple of years, if not decades. So that's the first point. I think we need to manage expectations. Secondly, I would say that if we will succeed, then there will be a place, a designated place where countries could come together and keep discussing things related to cybersecurity and state behavior in cyberspace. If there will not be decision, Earth will keep turning, but as Chris said, there will not be designated place. There will be competing proposals in the UN General Assembly First Committee, and there will be probably some kind of continuation of the process until we will reach a consensual outcome. So that said, in past 10 years, on the one of the major issues or one of the major achievements that GG achieved in arriving to consensual agreement on 11 norms of state behavior in cyberspace, including application of international law to cyberspace. So we have 32 countries, individual countries, who have published their interpretation how international law is applicable in cyberspace according to their national position, as well as African Union countries. African Union has a position, and European Union in December presented its own position. So my count is more or less 100 countries have already pointed or explained how they understand the norm that international law is applicable in countries. It's half of the UN, which means that sooner or later, if these explanations will show the tendency, maybe we will get kind of consensual or at least unified understanding how international law applies in the cyberspace. So then, of course, the big discussion is whether 11 norms that have been approved by consensus by a number of General Assembly resolutions are sufficient or not. Some countries argue that they are sufficient, and all we need is just implementation of existing norms, with the caveat that maybe once they are implemented, we will discover that some new norms are needed. Some countries are saying, no, we still need to think about new norms without caring whether existing norms are fully implemented or not. The same is this discussion about new treaty, whether existing legal framework is sufficient to regulate or to be applied for cyberspace, or we need a new convention. Here is also no agreement or no convergence of agreement. Majority of countries says no, that we need to apply existing laws. Some countries are saying no, we need to fill the gaps and build the new convention. On the mechanism, as Chris already alluded, there is either to make it more or less repetition of open-ended working group and perpetuate this discussions on 5 pillars. One being threats, one being application of norms, then third is international law, fourth is capacity building, and 6 is confidence building measures, or 5th is confidence building measures. Or we need to make it much more practical and workable and downsize the number of meetings per year, because open-ended working group is meeting 3 weeks a year. And the current proposal that France tabled is to decrease the number to two weeks a year, and making it much more practical and hands-on. And then, of course, the big question is about multi-stakeholder participation. And here, there is a clear difference between UN Geneva and UN New York. In Geneva, multi-stakeholder participation is much more accepted by virtually every organization and every body in Geneva. In New York, it is much more challenged, specifically in the first committee. I was surprised that engagement with the other stakeholders took place. First of all, it is not formal meeting. Formal meeting is suspended, and informal meeting is opened. And in February session, it was more or less 1 hour out of 5 working days. So not too much. And then, of course, question about vetoing countries, whether countries has a right to veto participation of stakeholders in this future permanent mechanism or not, is a big question. And then what shape will take capacity building? Because there is one consensus in the room that capacity is insufficient in every country in the world, maybe not in few, but how to make sure that this capacity building mechanism is efficient, who pays for it, and that there is no duplication, and so that there is a bit of a discussion how to organize it in the most efficient way. The trust fund, that's the standard thing in UN. If you do something, you need a voluntary trust fund. Proposals on the table, most likely it will be accepted because it is voluntary. So these are my observations. I'm not that pessimistic as Chris is, but certainly July session will be negotiation session, because until now there hasn't been any negotiations. It was just discussions, I would say.
Right. Thanks, Janis. That's helpful. Let's hold the multi-stakeholder questions for a bit. I just want to drill down a little bit more on some of this. I mean, maybe people might be interested to hear, given what we just saw with the cybercrime treaty, about which we did a session in this series earlier in the year, where the Russians came with this idea for a new global treaty and managed to get everybody to sign on, including the Western countries, despite all the human rights people saying this is a disaster and so on. The Russians have been saying for a long time, and now the Chinese are on board too, this notion that you need a new binding international set of rules. And maybe you could explain to people a little bit more about what exactly are they trying to get at with that? I mean, how do they see binding, international rules and a process around binding international rules being more, in keeping with what they're trying to achieve, versus why are Western countries and so on opposing this? What's really going on with that debate? Chris, could you just say something about that?
Yeah, so a couple things. First of all, I would say on the cybercrime treaty, as an aside, the Russians didn't get nearly anything they wanted out of that. It ended up being very much not what the Russians wanted. Now, there are some problems with it, but I think it's unfair to say it's really a Russian treaty or it's like so flawed it can't be signed on. I think a lot of it's in the implementation. So even though that was a Russian initiative, they just didn't succeed. In this area, this is something they've been pushing for a very, very long time, and we've opposed for, I mean, when I was in the government, we opposed for a very long time for a couple of reasons. One, you said, and it's true, that even though we have these norms out there, non-binding and voluntary to be sure, they're still political commitments, and yet we see countries violate these all the time, and there's no accountability. Now, do you really think if there was a binding treaty that there'd be any accountability? Accountability is the key, not having a binding treaty, I think. So I don't think a treaty really does much for you. Second, we're still in the early stages of figuring out what the right contours of this are, even with the norms. So actually moving to a treaty, I think, is problematic. But what the Russians want out of this is goes to a statement we talked about earlier. They want information security. They view things that challenge the state, that are potentially disruptive to their state order, as something they want to ban. So this is what we would think of as political debate. So they have a much more expansive idea, and they tried this in the cybercrime treaty without success, but they certainly want to do this in the context of this treaty. The other thing is, quite frankly, I think the Russians and Chinese in particular want to have a treaty to constrain actors who follow treaties, and they won't be constrained themselves. And so that's a problem as well. So, and I think there's a lot of existing stuff out there, like existing international law that can be applied to cyberspace, and you don't necessarily need a whole new treaty that might be at odds with some of the things that exist. You shouldn't have different rules for cyberspace than you do for the physical world. But they've been pushing this for some time. As Giannis said, I think there is not anywhere near a consensus on this. That maybe a treaty is something we look at down the line, long from now, but we're not close to that. But yet they're going to continue to push for this because they think that's something that is in their favor and will work to their favor. But again, I think the accountability part is the key part of that I don't expect them to follow, no matter if you have a treaty or anything else, because they haven't, even with existing treaties in non-cyberspace, you've seen activities like the invasion of Ukraine, which certainly don't comport with the treaties that are out there.
Right, great. And by the way, I want to note that Alex Klimberg has joined us. Hi, Alex. Greetings from Vienna. We're just going around on the particular point of the Russian-Chinese initiative around having a new treaty as an extension of the larger discussion around what's going on in OEWG. So you can jump in on that in a sec. We just hear from Sheetal and Giannis, if you want to add anything on that, go ahead.
Thanks, and hi, Alex. Good to see you. I think all I would say on the cybercrime treaty is that it was, I think from the very beginning, yes, another example of what we often call forum shopping, right? An attempt to achieve the same goal by just throwing the net wide and trying in many different spaces. It also aligns with a Russian and other and allies' views that there are only very limited spaces and roles for any stakeholders for the multi-stakeholder governance approach that you spoke about at the very beginning when it comes to the governance of digital technologies or their use and constraining their use or what we're talking about here. The modalities for that process are often seen as an improvement on the OEWG ones, but the reference or the bar is so low that I don't think we should be seeing that as progress. It was still a negotiation of a treaty that was very challenging for stakeholders to engage with, and the outcome is suboptimal, even though, of course, as you say, Chris, the proof will be in the pudding, as we like to say here in the UK, which means in the implementation and what happens next. It's still very disappointing from a human rights perspective.
Yeah. Yeah, well, let's not get too far into the cybercrime treaty debate, though, because we already had that in this group. So just on this, thanks, Sheetal, just on the Russian treaty proposal. Giannis, Alex, you guys have any thoughts you'd like to add?
No, I think Chris said it all.
Okay, Alex.
So first of all, apologies for joining late, and therefore I'm not exactly sure if we're only talking about the treaty or the wider frame that it was moving in.
The wider, and then now we're as an add-on to that, I asked, why don't we focus in particular on this dimension, because Giannis and others had mentioned it at some length.
Sure. So just to pick up a little bit on what also Chris and Sheetal mentioned beforehand, and maybe this was covered already, so apologies. It's important to consider that since 1998, Russia has been pursuing very, very clearly the same objective. And that was the first time they drafted the resolution, 1999, it was submitted. And that was, of course, this information security definition, and that should be enrolled into some type of legally binding treaty. So there have been many different attempts on trying to accomplish this. You might have mentioned the Code of Conduct, which was the most recent version that was put out by the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and there's still a document out there, and all kinds of aims to accomplish more or less similar things. And one of the things that I've often said that the Russian and Chinese government were most interested in trying to accomplish was basically something that amounted to a global notice and take down system. So the main objective has always been obviously to protect their own cyberspace, parenthesis, from hostile content. And the way to do so technically was previously considered to be unlikely or impossible. Now we know that it is actually somewhat possible. but their main objective has always been to do this globally. And a global notice and take down scheme obviously is oriented around agreeing on what is bad content internationally, and then effectively forcing through legal means, if possible, but also non-legal means where that's not possible, which is what China has been doing in Africa, to force, for instance, governments to take action to remove content from the web that might still be accessible beyond, for instance, the Great Firewall. Now, the ad hoc committee meeting on the Cybercrime Treaty was pretty much the end run to go directly to what they've been trying to accomplish indirectly for about 15 years. And that was always going to be something that the like-minded Western group was never going to put up with. But as Chris knows much better than I, diplomats don't always get to choose the battles they fight. So this is something everybody had to engage in and also try to do their best to have some type of positive outcome. But the outcome that they really wanted from the beginning was something along those lines, some type of notice and takedown scheme that would force governments to basically treat bad content nationally as an international issue. So that's just one thing I want out there, because this is, you know, the quintessence of why, for instance, the U.S. government and others have been against any type of legal treaty, because in particular, this is where people would like to end up. So I don't know if that covers something you haven't covered, or if it's in any way fits the previous discussion. But just another thing on what Sheetal just mentioned beforehand, also about the modalities, although I think that's for the next points coming up. Even though the ad hoc committee was more or less the doomed committee from the start, I mean, there were potential things to get out of it, but it was kind of doomed from the beginning. There was, I thought, interesting developments in terms of the modalities. Maybe we can talk about that going forward. So even though, of course, the actual involvement of the non-state actors was very much lacking, the fact that they were identified at all, I think, was a great leap forward. And that's actually something that I put down to the multi-stakeholder initiatives plethora that started really with our Global Commission of Stability for Cyberspace, but was replicated with the Microsoft Charter of Trust, Tech Accord, and the Siemens Charter of Trust, and similar initiatives, and effectively has been, a clear development for years now, and that is, what is the definition and the role of the multi-stakeholder? So maybe we can get to that later on, but even though I agree with Sheetal that the actual practical involvement during the ad hoc committee meetings was low, the fact that they were even recognized at all was a big step forward, and I think we should talk a little bit more about that going forward as well.
Let's do that right now. Let's talk about the role of stakeholders in these processes and what they've brought to the table and contributed, both within the United Nations environment and externally. So within the United Nations context, as I think Chris and Johannes both mentioned, right now, the way that the approval process works for stakeholders to get engaged allows governments to kind of unilaterally veto, and a lot of stakeholders have been kept out of these discussions by Russia and China in particular. I think also Ukraine in some cases, objecting to them. And one of the big things I heard people debating all last week was whether there shouldn't be in the new permanent mechanism, a more easy access kind of scheme for stakeholders, and a lot of people, particularly from the autocracy, saying, no, we don't want that. What we have is sufficient. There are about 100 organizations that are accredited and participating, which sounds pretty good, but it's kind of hard to tell exactly what their impact has really been. How much has multi-stakeholder participation really impacted the UN process so far, folks? Do you have any thoughts on this, Chris?
Yeah, so I think it has, even though a lot of organizations get blocked. And I think if you look at the list, a lot of the Western organizations have been blocked. Some have gotten in through, other accreditation processes like ECOSOC, for instance, Chatham House and others, but a lot have been blocked, including my old organization, as I said, Microsoft and a bunch of others. And I think the reality is, as much as diplomats think of themselves, and look, I've been both a state stakeholder and a non-state stakeholder, they really don't have the answers to all these questions. They don't know the trade space very well. They desperately, I think, need the participation of other stakeholders to understand some of the issues. And they all say that, but then when they actually get to the level of engaging, it varies significantly. I think a lot of the, Russia and China think stakeholders are just proxies for the U.S. and others. That's not true. They have their own interests, certainly. But I think even with that, there's been interest. A lot of the stakeholders, even the ones who have been blocked, have been able to go under the auspices of another organization that gets in, or sometimes states have included them. And it's not that important, frankly, to make a statement in the UN. As you heard last week, everyone's making a statement until you want to kill yourself. But what's important is engaging on the sidelines, of actually being there and being able to influence where delegations are. And a number of countries, like Australia, for instance, is a good one, have convened stakeholders in a more formal process to get input. I think that, you know, there have been processes outside the UN that help that. Alex and me on the Global Commission. You know, to give you one example of an impact, one of the things that came out of the Global Commission was a suggestion for a norm or an articulation of the idea that the backbone of the internet, the core of the internet, was something that should be protected. And that was reflected in some of the UN reports in terms of it being considered a critical infrastructure. So that, I think, was a significant impact. But they do have an impact because through that more informal process. At the same time, you know, the other thing I think that's missing is, unfortunately, as much as we like to talk about the importance of norms and all these things have happened, if you get outside the bowels of the UN, they're not really mainstreamed in a lot of other contexts. A lot of countries don't, a lot of higher political level of countries don't really talk about the norms, even when they're calling out misbehavior in cyberspace, with some exceptions. This happened at the head of at the EU level. They did call out a norm violation at one point, but normally that doesn't happen. You go to industry and most people don't know that happens. But if you want these to actually have impact and enforce, it's important to have those other stakeholders involved and also proselytizing this. But it's really an imperfect system now. You know, the Cybercrime Treaty was much better in including stakeholders. I call that the bronze process, not the gold process. But this would be the paper process. It's not even close to that.
Right.
Bill?
Your thoughts? I mean, you when you were with GPD, you were doing multi-stakeholder engagement and trying to get civil society people engaged. What's your sense of what's going on with the OEWG and the larger UN situation?
A couple of points. One of them, just jumping off what Chris just said about socialization of what's happening at the UN, which can be not only challenging place to engage with because of the dynamics and norms of the space itself, but also, especially for civil society, you know, it can be a question of resourcing and just time bandwidth. And that's why I think it's important to have stakeholders who come back and connect the discussions that happen there to what else is happening, perhaps in a national context, and to relevant frameworks. It could be cybersecurity policies or data protection. You know, it could be a range of different frameworks. But when more simply like people and stakeholders know about these discussions and are able to point to I mean, even if we think of it as challenging, it's still the UN. It's still a very high level process, and connect commitments that are made there to what can happen on the ground, that can have an impact. And I think we've seen that. I tried to allude to it earlier with the proliferation of national cybersecurity legislation. We can see that there is a similar level of prioritization to certain aspects of what should be in a cybersecurity piece of legislation or policies or strategies and what's expected of other stakeholders. And I think that the OEWG has helped with that, and civil society has helped with that, and private sector actors as well. Just one example of an issue which I was researching a bit for the Association for Progressive Communications, APC, that has been very active in the space, and I can see some people involved in that network are here as well. And it is gender and the disproportionate impact of poor cybersecurity on women and vulnerable groups, and the need to address that proactively and embed that in discussions around cybersecurity, including at the first committee. I think civil society and certain states that have championed this issue have had an impact, connecting it to the Women, Peace and Security agenda, but also within the OEWG itself, developing a framework. So last week, a working paper was drafted and presented by a number of states and co-sponsored by many more, representing a whole range of different groups, that moves the needle forward on that discussion and makes it more concrete and really gives advice and builds capacity of what it means to have a gender responsive approach to these issues. And I think that's really important. And I really believe that if, and based on my research, that without the engagement of civil society in that issue area, we wouldn't necessarily have seen so much impact on and progress on that topic.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Thanks. Giannis and Chris, or sorry, Alex, anything on this point?
Yeah, so I mean, I don't know to what extent you actually discussed what even norms are and how they're expected to work, but as you know, the card-carrying academic more or less in the panel, I think it's kind of important to remind ourselves what they're supposed to accomplish and what they're not supposed to accomplish. They're not supposed to be binding rules, and they're not. That's exactly the opposite of what it's supposed to be. They're supposed to set behavior, and they do so over time and over rough consensus. So for them to be effective, they also need to have as wide a pool of people involved as possible, and that does not only mean states, that definitely means also non-state actors, and it has to be, of course, credible. And for that, they need to have technical specialists. So the UNGG, which was a very unique and interesting development, even though GGEs have existed before and since. This is one of the only GGEs, and Chris will correct me if I'm wrong, that was actually quoted by the UN SecGen, and also the U.S. Secretary of State directly in high-level addresses. The UNGG was a big thing, and this UNGG came about due to more or less big power politics between the U.S. and Russia. The story goes, I don't know if it's true or not, that it was part of the deal for Russian support for the IGF, that U.S. agreed to have the UNGG, and for the first couple of years, nothing happened. And then after the third GGE thing started to kick off, and then norms started to crystallize out as something worth talking about. And the whole idea of the norm discussion from the Russian point of view is that would be a slow sliding ramp to actual binding treaty. While the like-minded group was more about, let's kind of all together and agree upon reinforcing international laws that exist right now, but also identifying bad behavior. And this gets to the practical part. I firmly believe, and I saw this more or less when I was in my role as head of the Center for Cybersecurity at the World Economic Forum, that the norms that the GGE enunciated effectively played a very important role in mainstreaming a lot of the global community as what was good cyber behavior, what was bad cyber behavior, and in particular the role of Russia in being a bad cyber actor. And part of the reaction that we saw after, for instance, the invasion of Ukraine was based along the line that there have been repeated statements about violations of these GGE norms. So Chris's former colleague at the State Department, Michel Markov, used to say violations of the norm confirm the norm. So the fact that norms were being violated effectively helped us call them out. And I think one of the reasons why, to great surprise on the part of many people in the United States, but one of the reasons why so many countries were willing to take a firm line on the sudden apparent overt Russian aggression was the fact that they had been hearing a lot of these more subtle aggression stories in cyberspace for 5, 6, 7 years. So I think those norms were quite important. They set the expectations, and I think the norms were only effectively considered to be helpful because they were developed with increasingly large involvement of actors. The first bits of the GGE really were governments, but increasingly they started growing out the net, and the working group, expanded that net even further. And this is a trend that I think that the UN is finally catching up to, that this is basically a policy space that requires the involvement of more actors than just government. Thanks,
Alex. I want to open it up to the broader group pretty soon, but I still want to get around to one other aspect of this multi-stakeholder thing, which is the kind of stuff that's been put forward by multi-stakeholder groupings like the commission that you guys were involved with. But before I do that, Giannis, did you have any just on this point of the non-state participants in the UN process impact?
Yeah, no, Chris already mentioned that in my view, the biggest impact is outside the meeting room. So there is a kind of a tradition of organizing all kind of seminars during the week of open-ended working group. We organized one on national capacity building in response to incidents. In other words, about CERT. systems around the world, and particularly in Latvia, Dominican Republic, and Indonesia. And these are, let's say, substantively rich events which are attended by delegates, and they learn things. It's also a capacity building, and I see stakeholder participation and capacity building as one of the biggest impacts of the working group. Coming to the GG, there is one element that needs to be probably mentioned that led to creation of open-ended working group. If I'm not mistaken, GG had a limited number of participation. There were about 15 or 25 experts around the world. They were nominated by Secretary General. I have chaired one GG on lethal autonomous weapon systems, and that was kind of open-ended working GG. There was all countries nominated experts, and these were like a plenary meeting. So and that was seen also as a kind of elitist club. Even Russians were there, Chinese were there, Americans were there. Still, there was some kind of a discomfort that not all countries have been participating. So as a result, this open-ended working group from that perspective is a better format, even much more messier and difficult.
Exactly, yeah. But I do want to open it to the floor, but just before we do, maybe Alex, maybe you could say something about the Global Commission that you ran. I think it's important that when we talk about this role of non-state actors, not just what they're able to do or not do in the UN context, but how they're able to try to contribute to the intellectual and normative environment from outside. And, you know, as I said at the outset, we've had initiatives from Microsoft and others putting forward various proposals. I think one of the more notable initiatives, though, that was undertaken on a multi-stakeholder basis was the Global Commission on Stability of Cyberspace. And Alex, you ran that. So could you just say a little bit about, I mean, and then I do want to open it up just a little bit about what its main impacts were, whether or not how it's filtered into the larger zeitgeist here around these issues.
So I probably can't go into the whole thing, because I think from my perspective, obviously I had the whole chapter coming out in the book about this. But fundamentally, I think to put it in historic context, the GCSC basically was in many ways the inevitable commission. It kind of started at a time when it was clear that the fifth GGE was going to fail. That was already identified kind of like at the outset. And this was already around 2015, and it was kind of obvious that there was not going to be an agreement. We already had, however, in the fourth GGE report, a strong basis for the norms component. And we also had in that report, we had a very specific mission that required also governments to consult with non-state actors better. And that was something we built on, including the mandate that we derived from the Build Commission, which preceded us, as well as the so-called London process of the Global Conference in Cyberspace, which was a very government-focused, basically cyber IGF, which could have continued as a cyber IGF if the political will had been there. And all these three things came together more or less with the usual other accidents of history in terms of budget and the right people being at the right time to basically create what was probably the first multi-stakeholder commission that really had a more lasting impact in this space. Not the Build Commission didn't do a good job with what they did, but effectively their impact probably was less than they would have hoped. And I think what the impact was, not only the norms that we developed, but also the cyber stability framework in which those norms were sitting in. So the commission was launched in February 2017 at the Munich Security Conference, and basically presented its final report in November 2019 at the Paris Peace Forum. And it was always highly attended. Governments only participated as financier through the board, but the members that sat at the commission, like Chris and Wolfgang Kleinwächter and many others who you're familiar with, they were nominated by us, the Hague Center for Strategic Studies, and then our partner later on, the East-West Institute. And I think one of our main deliverables that I think is most important, although I'm very attached to, for instance, the norm against non-interference in the public core of the internet, which we can talk more about, was the mainstreaming of the multi-stakeholder component. And it's not an accident that both the Charter of Trust and the Tech Accord used us directly as models. Not only that, but the Paris Peace Forum, which adopted from their 8 recommendations, 6 of them are directly from us. A lot of our core content as well as also policy outlook. And I don't think we invented it. It was all our genius of our design. It was really the time. So some part of the time was simply the weakness of government to do here, but part of that weakness was brought basically by a lot of the private sector, in particular the president of Microsoft, calling out governments for not having performed well in this space. So one of the key backers of our commission were first and foremost the Dutch government at the beginning. So there was 3 main principal backers and then many others that joined later. But the real starting lineup was basically the Dutch government, Microsoft, and Internet Society. And that was effectively how we also construed our multi-stakeholder involvement between the private sector, government, and civil society. And I think that our lasting contribution has been the multi-stakeholder involvement, which is not only down to us, obviously, but also some of the issues like Chris already mentioned in terms of the public core of the internet, but also draws to where we failed. So since we were the champion for the public core, to give you one example,
Alex, say what the public core is first for people who are not.
Sure. The norm against non-interference in the public core of the internet basically says that all actors, including state and non-state, should not interfere in the confidentiality, in the integrity, or the availability of the basic functions of the internet. So we don't say confidentiality, we say integrity, availability, and that does not only include the backbone of the internet itself, but also includes the cryptographic means of signing domains. It includes the processes, the domain name system, the critical routing protocols. There's a lot to go into it. That's not only hardware. Actually, hardware was the least important of the 4 points that we mentioned, and that was most out of bounds. So we have hardware mentioned towards the end, but the very beginning is more or less the IANA function, DNS, BGP, and protocols. And the rationale here was that we needed to find, we did not want to use the term critical infrastructure, because infrastructure tends to be nationalized, or it comes under state purview. And the whole point of calling it public core removes that component. And unfortunately, when we were not around to push this point, the easier interpretation of starting calling it critical infrastructure came back. And now, of course, we have now seen no less than 3 interpretations by the Russian government to reinterpret the public core towards that of critical infrastructure and towards that of something that has to be protected by states from non-state interference, which is actually the opposite of what we said. So there are a lot to go on here. I can go on obviously a lot longer than that, but I would really highlight not only the norm development, but also in particular the multi-stakeholder principle of participation as some of our main accomplishments.
Great, Alex, thanks. Let me open it up then. We've been having people have been chatting in the side. I've been seeing comments from Heikeker, who fortunately had to leave, Wolfgang, Judith, Jimson, others, I think Avri. If anybody would like to raise their hand and join the conversation, it'd be really great to have you. Please just say who you are, where you are, whatever you want to introduce yourself, okay? All right, let's start with Wolfgang and then Judith. Wolfgang.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, wonderful. I thank you, Bill, first of all, to make this seminar happen, because this is very timely, because we live in a time of transition, and I think cybersecurity is a subject which is will not go away, and we have a place. Insofar, you know, I more with Shetal when she said, okay, we have the guidelines and the principles from 2015. We have an institution, and when Janice added, we have to minimize our expectations. So then I'm in fully agreement, because it's good to have a place. And when Chris, with a little bit negative, you know, tone, said, okay, there is no need for another committee like we have with the peaceful use of the outer space. So I think you have a place where you can go, and where you bring problems which are in the outer space, you can bring to the committee. And to have a committee for the cyberspace, in my eyes, would make certain sense, even if nothing will come out of it. I'm very clear for that. But my you know, if nothing comes out from it, but there is a need that something comes out, then you have to think in alternatives. And here's my my idea that probably like-minded stakeholders, including governments, in particular from the global south, who have an interest that, you know, we are moving forward in more or less based on the outcome from the Global Commission, which Alex just outlined as a very effective multi-stakeholder network. So if we can create such a parallel process as an alternative, this could have a bigger impact and could organize pressure for the governments in such a cyberspace committee, which are unable to produce any reasonable outcome. So and we have in the IGF, so if the mandate of the IGF is extended beyond 2025, then this constitutes a platform which can be used for such an alternative or parallel process. And at the moment, Andrette is not here among us, so she has discussed also various proposals how to further enhance the best practice forum on cybersecurity. So I think that there is no need to reinvent the wheel. We have already some instruments. The challenge is to use them. So thank you. Back to Bill.
Okay, thanks, Wolfgang. That's very helpful. Let me take a couple of questions and then we'll open it up to panelists to respond. So Judith, go ahead.
Yes, hi, it's Judith Hellerstein. So I thought this was a fascinating discussion. I was late because I went to an earlier one that the World Bank was having on the Cybercrime Treaty, and I found that fascinating because Alexander Sega was saying that the UN and getting everyone and getting all the civil society and other governments educated about what was happening has led to a doubling of countries interested in ratifying and acceding to the Budapest Convention, which is like a fascinating content. But what I also thought was interesting is that he was saying is that that there is a lot that the treaty has now been not as bad as what we had heard about when you had your talk and others had their talks for civil society, and that there's a lot of guardrails put in, which is something different than what I heard from all these other talks I've been to. And I thought maybe the people here could comment on that, because I had thought that that the UN treaty was turning out to be something that would be harmful to civil society, and people think it's opposite now. So I thought I would interested in hearing comments on that. Thanks.
Okay, Judith, thanks. So yeah, we did in fact already do a session on the Cybercrime Treaty, but we could certainly circle back again to this point in the context of what we're doing today. Jimson, and then I'll come back to the panelists for thoughts. Jimson, go ahead.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you very much for organizing this. You've been helping us a lot to be up to date with cutting-edge information like this one. Thank you. Well, like as I participated in those working groups in Geneva, and I've heard many times, even the desert people, they say, oh, they're so happy to hear different perspective. And even in the last phase of the working group on enhanced cooperation, based on even the suggestion I brought forward, a lot of government, even the Russians, the US, the Japanese, they all came together and have in fact, were to establish common ground, except maybe for a country, maybe like Saudi Arabia, that objected to it. So it was a really pleasant environment, which I believe was good because other stakeholders were there, were in the room and providing other perspectives. So I'm just wondering, DESA that took that Geneva activity, how come, because it's based in New York, how come it's not able to enable other stakeholders to be part of New York activities? That's number one. And number two, since we're expecting that report July, and it's most likely that it's going to be deadlock or there will be no consensus. So is it possible as part of WISI's review to recommend that other stakeholders be part of the next phase? Because even in Nigeria, for example, and the Global South, thank you, Wolfgang, for bringing that up. In Global South, there's a lot of concern about attack on a public core. Alex, thanks you for refining that phrase for public core. Okay, so there's a lot of concern because a lot of our economy is dependent on the digitals right now. and the fiber, and there'll be a lot of cuts. There'll be a lot of attacks. We don't know who is doing this thing. So we are really concerned. There has to be an agreement. We really need it for us to build our confidence going forward. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thanks, Gibson. Yeah, we didn't talk enough about the, we don't have enough time here to cover everything, obviously, but the developing country aspect of this is obviously very, very important. And certainly in the last OEWG, a lot of the conversation was developing country government representatives decrying their vulnerabilities to attacks. And in that context, a lot of discussion around the attribution aspects. And what I find fascinating, the Chinese keep demanding that the Americans be able to actually show that they're doing all the bad things that the Americans say they're doing, which is kind of fun. But anyway, I think it's an interesting and important aspect. So let's circle back to panelists then. Respond to Wolfgang and Judith and Gibson's points. Just go in order again. Chris, would you like to start it?
Well, first on Gibson's point, the reason it happened, it was a decision. When they launched the open-ended working group, there was literally weeks, I mean, if not months, of debate about other stakeholders. It kind of held everything else up, and Russia and China wouldn't budge on that. And you need consensus in that group, and they did not want the participation of stakeholders in a really robust way. And this compromise was worked out, but the compromise allowed for any one state to object, and of course Russia just objects. So, it's unfortunate. It's what you get out of the consensus process. It's not sufficient. I completely agree with that. I think we also have to recognize, just more generally, not everything's going to get done in the UN. The UN is a good forum for some things, but I think the biggest glaring issue, and I sort of disagree with Alex on the point that yes, the norms have value. Yes, the norms have been mainstream in a sense, but they're still not getting that high level attention. But I would say that the biggest problem with the norms is, the biggest good thing about the norms is they create expectations, and they are political commitments, and you can then have states rally with each other to hold accountable other states who violate those norms. And we've seen that happen. Here's the problem. We actually haven't done that. The accountability part is not something you're ever going to get in the UN, for the same reason you mentioned on attribution. You're never going to get an agreement in attribution in the UN, because attribution is a political issue at the state level. The Russians are also, like the Chinese, want absolute proof. I used to be a prosecutor. Beyond a reasonable doubt still has, is a certain level. They want absolute proof. There is not absolute proof in anything in life. And one of the reasons they want that absolute proof is that they can figure out how we know it, or how the other side knows it, and then cut off ability to know it in the future. So that's kind of a shill argument to some extent. So the accountability part, imposing accountability for violations, is something we haven't, as the global community, been good at. That needs to happen. It's not going to happen in the UN. Capacity building will happen in part in the UN, but much outside the UN too. I think the thing that developing countries want more than anything else is capacity building. My old organization, the Global Forum on Cyber Expertise, help coordinate that. Certainly the UN has a role in that. ITU has a role. There's lots of folks who play in this. Industry has a role. But if you try to limit it to all one place and have the one ring that rules them all in the UN, that's not going to be successful. You need to have a multi-stakeholder approach. Judith, on the point of the Cybercrime Convention, I do think it has flaws. I do think it has concerns. I think it has a lot more protection language than people give it credit for, but the worry is, unlike the Council of Europe Convention, which also was decried when it was first put out by a lot of not being human rights protecting. It has been, but that's been about like-minded states who you hope will uphold those human rights, where this is more general. And the worry is those states are going to abuse it or use it as a pretext. And that's why I think implementation, capacity building around this is going to be critical going forward on this. And Wolfgang, finally, to your point, I think, look, as I said, I think you can have forums outside the UN that will help. And I think there are ways to do that and architect that. But the number one thing, you don't just want a series of people talking about things. Yes, the UN COPUS is a forum to go to, but nothing ever gets done. It's where issues go to die. You need something where it's actually have this accountability, this progress, and that may not be in the UN at the end of the day.
Right. Yeah. The UN is not the whole game in any event, but it plays an important role in a larger ecosystem, and that's the point. Sheetal, go ahead.
Thanks, Bill. I would just add to what Chris said, that I think, and perhaps this is what was said before as well about incremental progress, that it is really important to continue to use this space as one to advance more norms that are about not norms, not norms in the sense of the UN norms, sorry, but expectations around behavior that build on what we have, which needs to be in part the implementation of what we already have, the sharing of interpretations about the implementation, sharing of progress, and continuing to engage more actors in the discussion so that the norms and the other aspects of the frameworks that have been agreed go beyond the rooms where they're discussed and actually have an impact. And I know we didn't get to talk too much about that. I did speak a bit about where I think you could see that impact with an effect on, for example, national policies and strategies, expectations around behavior. There does need to be an increasing reference, I think, to the framework, and that happens when more people know about it and are utilizing it, and that can happen through regional mechanisms as well as other multilateral and multi-stakeholder mechanisms. So there's still a lot to be done, but as I said when I started, I said I think it's important to recognize that when you have something built like this, it's very difficult to destroy it. So you have to use it and build on it. And that, I think, is what is happening. So I'm trying to be positive because I think it's a very challenging atmosphere. And to stretch my metaphor, I think the climate is very stormy, but the question, I suppose, we're all trying to figure out how much we think the foundations are secure. And whether this is sort of like a hurricane or tornado or whatever it is. So we can discuss that, but I think we have something and we do need to implement what has been discussed. I haven't spoken to Judith's point about the Cybercrime Convention, but happy to put a link in about some of the civil society concerns around that still exist. But as you say, Chris, it's really about implementation at this stage. Thank you.
You have got lots of metaphors for us today, Sheetal. Okay, Yanis?
Yeah, thank you. To Wolfgang's point about alternative arrangement, I think alternative arrangement will not work in a sense of intergovernmental process. It will work in, let's say, in substantive sense to move forward, let's say, cybersecurity situation in the world, but not in UN. So UN is a universal organization, and in one way or another, there will be something sooner or later. So that's my view on this, and to whether this is review process can do something if open-ended working group will not come to a consensual agreement. I'll say no, because these are two separate processes, and there is no really link between WSIS and open-ended working group. Thanks.
Okay, Alex.
So a lot of good points. I would just start with Wolfgang's point regarding the PPF of cybersecurity and similar. I share some of what was said beforehand. I don't know to what extent a full parallel process would be able to work. I mean, we've been hearing things about the Attribution Council for a long time. That's been a big issue for governments. Private sector very often has tried to short circuit this. The Cyber Peace Institute really had as one of its components actually the ability to be an attribution organization. That was always there. On the other hand, there are not the POA had a number of issues at the beginning which are theoretically solved now, but which I think could still benefit from a wider discussion. Like, for instance, when they were looking at problems of point of contact and similar exchanges of information. And I was really curious to view one point in the POA discussions that they just couldn't understand why the Chinese were having such a hard problem, putting down their points of contact. And it was simply because of the differences in governmental structure and how to deal with certain cyber incidents. It was nothing more complicated than that. And the Ministry of Foreign Affairs were being completely obtuse in their understanding of how the Chinese government worked that way. And it was fascinating to watch both Western governments break their heads on this very easy problem to solve. which was that you had to have more points of contact than simply one, and that couldn't only be in the MOFA. But it also draws to attention one of the big advantages of having a big tent, also multi-stakeholder involvement, which is you can have more different types of actors involved. You could even have actors involved that are not accredited by governments, for instance, right? Or accredited by governments but not part of government. So I do think that Wolfgang's point of looking at maybe not a type of parallel process would be good. I don't know if the BPF cybersecurity, its existence in the IGF has been a little bit low at the moment, although it started big. I don't know if that's the right organization to grow up, but a parallel process would maybe allow such type of basically aspects of protocol to be sidestepped more easily and have information exchange flow more easily. As an operational cyber person, the last thing we always need is process in information exchange. So that's the wider we have it, the more informal we have it, the more we actually get done. And once you start formalizing things, you end up in this ridiculous discussion that stalled for so long about points of contact. I think the ad hoc, the HC cybercrime treaty has been covered pretty well. My opinion was it was doomed from the start, and then everybody had to put on a brave face to try to deal with it. But I think everybody's said enough about that. Jimson's point also in particular regarding the next steps of the public regarding the public core and similar. I think it's really important to note that as I said before, Russia has now 3 times tried to reinterpret the public core meaning and definition, and Jimson thankfully drew attention to some issues that have been plaguing, in particular, African nations with routing and availability in recent months, which have been put on public core mandate. And I think it's important to highlight that I don't know if we know what the issues have been, but exactly, and what the cause of it has been. But when we at HCSS were forced to basically make a statement to the ITU-T working group that had come up with this new interpretation of the public core, we really pointed out that to date, the biggest threat to the different parts of the public core not come from non-state actors, but from state actors. And that essentially the interesting features for me is looking more broadly is, does this constitute the global public good or the commons that we've constantly tried to get our head across in the internet? Is the internet a commons? Is it part of the internet a commons, etc.? Our answer is the public core is that part of the internet that is a commons. And that is the element that we can basically concentrate on. And not all of it requires binding legal treaties to work with. And sometimes I think the international system can be pretty imaginative when it comes up with solutions. It's not all treaties are only state treaties. Not all treaties have the same function, and there's been room in the international system for new organizations to develop. The Red Cross is a complete unique organization, and such things are possible in the future as well. So I think fundamentally the public core should be understood for what it is, which is an opportunity to discuss the internet in different terms, and not only think about it in state terms like multilateral or even old versions of multi-stakeholder, but actually expand it a little bit. And this is something that I keep on hoping for, but since the GCSC is no longer active and many of the original sponsors of the public core have moved on to greater and lesser things, sometimes we have to deal with the fact that this is being misinterpreted. So I would very much welcome additional interest in what the public core meant. Just to make it clear, Jimson, I did not define the public core. That's what the commission did. That was what Wolfgang, that's what Chris and others did. And even we built upon the work of others, including, by the way, going back to Association of Progressive Communication in 2003, which had a similar idea. So this is actually a long-standing idea that we've constantly been building upon, and we still need to build on it, because in particular, I think the biggest issue is going to be also in the global south, where availability issues based on routing security and similar are most prevalent, and we're seeing many of the public core instability issues are probably down to state activities that can be addressed with a norm or an agreement or an expectation that states shouldn't be involved in this type of malicious behavior. All right. Thanks, Bill. I'm done.
All right. We have run to the end of the clock, so we're going to have to call it a game there. I think there's a lot more, obviously, to say. I think didn't. Maybe I should do another session sometime just on the whole concept of international norms how much norms matter and how do they matter? Because I think sometimes, both in the case of cybersecurity, but also more generally, there's a sort of lack of connection between folks who want to see concrete, discernible outcomes impacted by decisions or rules or so on, and the discussion around norms. But I think the norms do play an important role. And I think also there's more to be said about the developing country aspect than we've had a chance. But I appreciate the conversation. I thank panelists for their contributions and everybody else who got into the conversation as well. As always, I want to thank Jason Buckwhite, who's the executive director of CITI, there on the screen, for making this happen, running the platform and so on. And I remind you what I said at the outset. Normally we meet every month, but in March we will not. We'll reconvene in April, and there will be announcements sent out about the events that we'll be doing then, about the event we'll be doing then. And the video of this will, as always, be posted to our website for the series and on YouTube. So thanks again to everybody. Appreciate it. And see you in April. Okay.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.